In this segment, we will study the brainstem and the cerebellum. As you recall from previous discussions, the brainstem is comprised of three structures: the midbrain, shown here in green, the pons in blue, and the medulla oblongata in this pale orange color. Posterior to the pons and the medulla oblongata, we have the cerebellum, which is separated by the fourth ventricle. Caudal to the medulla oblongata and continuous with it is the spinal cord. Structures above the brainstem include the diencephalon and the cerebrum. By virtue of its position between higher structures and the spinal cord, we're going to have a lot of longitudinal white matter tracts that contain axon fibers that are conveying information from the spinal cord to higher structures and from the cerebrum to the spinal cord. We are also going to have some transverse fibers here that will be communicating with the cerebellum. So one of the things that we will notice is not only do we have these white matter tracts that are passing through the brainstem, but we're also going to have some brainstem nuclei. And these are gray matter nuclei that have mostly cell bodies that will be processing information. So some of the information that will be ascending from the spinal cord will synapse in some of these gray matter nuclei on the way to the diencephalon, to the thalamus. And from there, it will project on up to the cerebral cortex. So we're also going to have some descending information arising from the cerebrum that's going to pass through the brainstem on the way either to brainstem nuclei or all the way down to the spinal cord. And we're going to have some brainstem nuclei both in the medulla oblongata and the pons that are in close communication with the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is going to have some feedback loops that are going to go through the diencephalon and the cerebrum as well. So we're going to have extensive connections between the brainstem and the cerebellum. And going back to these gray matter nuclei that are found throughout the brainstem, we will see that a lot of them are associated with cranial nerves. And we can see some cranial nerves here, and we'll look at them in the next slide. But some of these cranial nerves will be sensory or have sensory components that will be bringing information from the periphery, sensation, to some of these brainstem nuclei, and from there they will go to the thalamus and then be relayed to their appropriate cerebral cortex. And sometimes we will have descending information, descending motor commands from the cerebral cortex that will synapse in some of these gray matter nuclei that will then send commands out by some of the motor components of these cranial nerves. So we're going to have a lot of gray matter in these nuclei that are embedded within these white matter tracts that are passing and relaying information from lower areas to higher areas through the brainstem, as well as from higher areas to lower areas and between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So in the next slide, let's look at the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves and where they attach. As you've noticed, a lot of them, 3 through 12, attach on the brainstem. 2 here is going to go back to the thalamus, which is part of the diencephalon. And notice that 1 is absent. And that is because it's the olfactory nerve. So the olfactory nerve is going to bring information about sense of smell. As we know, it's going to synapse on the olfactory bulb, which is going to be on the underside of the cerebrum here, which that information will then be conveyed from the olfactory bulb down the olfactory tract, and it will synapse then directly in the cerebral cortex. If you remember from our discussion last time, that all other sensory information must pass through the thalamus before it's going to reach the cortex. And therefore, we notice that a lot of our cranial nerves are going to be attached to the brainstem, and the optic nerve, which is going to bring information about vision, is then going to become the optic tract, and that's going to find its way directly to the thalamus. So we will see that the thalamus is going to be, once again, it's part of the diencephalon, is going to be the gatekeeper for all incoming sensory information. And all sensory information, in order for us to become consciously aware of it, is going to have to pass through the thalamus before it will reach the cerebral cortex. So I just wanted to show this picture of the cranial nerves because almost all of them are going to attach in the brainstem somewhere. So we will see within the brainstem, we will see nuclei associated with these cranial nerves. That's these gray matter collections of neuron cell bodies that will be processing information and then doing something with it before sending it on to some other processing center. All right, so let's start with the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata, as you can imagine, since it's the most caudal part, or the most inferior part of the brainstem, is going to be bringing all kinds of information up from the spinal cord and passing it up higher to other areas of the brainstem, the diencephalon, and eventually to the cerebral cortex. We will also see that it's going to be conveying information that's descending from the cerebral cortex and from other brainstem nuclei down to the spinal cord. So we're going to see a lot of ascending and descending white matter through the medulla oblongata. We will also see centers, these gray matter centers called nuclei, that are going to be part of the autonomic nervous system as well as associated with cranial nerves. And we're going to see two major visceral functions that are going to be controlled from the medulla oblongata, one of which is heart function. So it's going to regulate your heart rate, the force of contraction of your heart, as well as vasomotor tone, which is going to affect such things as blood pressure. We're also going to regulate the rhythmicity of breathing, so the rate of breathing. And we're going to have some interplay with the pons in this. And between the medulla oblongata with its respiratory rhythmicity centers, those respiratory rhythmicity centers in the medulla oblongata will be communicating with two other centers for respiratory control in the pons called the apneustic and pneumotaxic centers. So if we delve in a little bit deeper, we should talk also about this reticular formation. There is a collection of gray matter that's diffuse, and hence the name reticular. There's just this meshwork of gray matter that ascends all the way through the midbrain. So it ascends, from the whole brainstem, so not just through the midbrain, from the medulla oblongata all the way through the pons, and it ends in the midbrain. So the reticular formation is going to be a collection of this gray matter cell bodies, gray matter nuclei that are going to be interspersed through this interconnected web of gray matter. And this is going to be very important for regulating autonomic functions in the context of awareness and arousal and even consciousness. So the reticular formation is going to regulate such things even as skeletal muscle tone and reflex reactions and the amount of skeletal muscle tone that you have, as well as your reactions to things. So how sensitive you are, how awake you are. In fact, this whole system, when the activity in the system becomes low, then you fall asleep. And when the reticular formation becomes aroused, then you become aroused and you become awakened. So the reticular formation is very important for the maintenance of awareness and consciousness. And so this reticular formation we're going to find throughout the entire brainstem and starting at the medulla oblongata. We're also going to see the several reflex centers, two of which we've already talked about. Our cardiovascular centers will be located in the medulla oblongata, and that's going to be comprised of the cardiac center and the vasomotor centers, which are fairly close together and anatomically difficult to differentiate. So a lot of times we just call them the cardiovascular centers. So the cardiac center is going to regulate the heart rate as well as the force of contraction of the heart, whereas the vasomotor center is going to control the luminal diameter of blood vessels, so dilation and constriction of blood vessels, which of course is going to affect such things as blood pressure. Our respiratory rhythmicity centers are going to be setting the pace for respiratory movements, and they will be in communication with other centers within the pons, called the apneustic and pneumotaxic centers, that are going to aid the respiratory rhythmicity centers in setting respiratory movements. All right. Attached to the medulla oblongata, we have cranial nerves 8 through 12. Why it says 5 here, I'm not really sure, but we're going to have 8 through 12 of our cranial nerve. 8 through 12 will be attached to the medulla oblongata. And I should say 8 here is actually on the lateral border between the medulla oblongata and the pons. So it's found right at the junction. So I think if I were to show it here, you could see it's right here. So it's right at the junction. And the nucleus associated with cranial nerve 8 is going to be residing in both the medulla oblongata and the pons. And cranial nerve 8 is going to process auditory information. So cranial nerve 8 actually is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. It's going to be bringing information from the ears, which contain two apparatuses, one of which is called the cochlea, and it's going to process information, auditory information, so hearing. And we're also going to have our vestibular complex, which has both the vestibule and semicircular canals, which is going to give us information about equilibrium and balance. So cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, will be bringing information about those things into the center, the nucleus associated with cranial nerve 8, which is going to be processing that information. And that information is found right between the border of the medulla oblongata and the pons. Cranial nerves 9 through 12 also have attachments on the medulla oblongata. There are several functions of the medulla oblongata that we've already alluded to in bringing information from the spinal cord up to the thalamus, as well as relaying information from the cerebrum to the spinal cord. So there are two nuclei that we're going to talk about. One is called the nucleus gracilis, which is medial and it's slender. The name gracile means slender or long and thin. And we have the nucleus cuneatus, which is wedge-shaped and it's more lateral of the two. Both of these are going to be bringing information from the body, somatic information about fine touch and proprioception. And proprioception is, as you recall, information about where your body parts are in space. So it's going to bring information about proprioception and fine touch from the body. And the gracile nucleus will be bringing information from the legs and the lower trunk, whereas the cuneate nucleus is going to be bringing information from, or I should say, going to be receiving information arriving from the upper trunk and the upper limbs. We're also going to have another nucleus that's going to be receiving sensory information from the viscera. So from the cardiovascular system, from the respiratory system, from the GI tract, and so forth. And this is going to be bringing sensory information, and that information will be received in the solitary nucleus. So I should say information from these viscera are going to be brought to the solitary nucleus. They're going to ascend to the solitary nucleus and synapse there. And then we're going to have the olivary nuclei, and we're going to talk specifically about the inferior olivary nuclei. There are actually two olivary complexes. There's an inferior, which deals with somatic muscle control, and a superior olive, which also resides between the border between the medulla oblongata and the pons, and that's going to deal more with auditory processing. So if we look at a picture of the medulla oblongata, and here it is, this is what we're sort of expanding on, and we're making it sort of transparent so we can see through it and we can see the various locations of where we would find these nuclei. We have here several bulges, and these are covering areas of gray matter, some of these gray matter nuclei. And we have some bulges here that are actually going to be white matter tracts. And these are going to be bringing information from cerebral cortex. So information about motor movements. So motor commands and information about planning motor movements, all of that is going to be generated from our cerebral cortex. We've got a primary motor cortex here that's going to be generating activity that's going to control somatic motor movement. So in other words, skeletal muscles. We're going to have this area here called the supplemental motor area or premotor cortex that's going to be involved a lot with the planning of those motor movements. And so those descending axons, which are called, well, arise from neurons called pyramidal neurons, are going to pass through the medulla oblongata on their way to the spinal cord. And interestingly, the anatomists who described the system thought that where they crossed looked like pyramids, the actual fibers themselves, descending fibers, look like pyramids, so they call them pyramids. And they said that where the decussation of the pyramids occurs, or I should say the crossing over of these pyramidal tracts occurs, is called a decussation. And decussation literally means crossing over. So hence the name decussation. So we have this pyramid-looking structures here, which are white matter tracts that are descending from the cerebral cortex with information about motor commands. And as you probably already know, the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body and vice versa. So the majority of these motor inputs to your skeletal muscles are going to be descending and crossing over at the level of the medulla oblongata. And they cross over right here at this crossing over the pyramids, using the Latin name, the decussation of the pyramids. All right, so that's one major feature that we're going to see on the medulla oblongata. And on the model that we had from lab, you'll see that they denote the decussation of the pyramids with this kind of cross-hatching here. And that's supposed to represent those fibers crossing over. Now, if we look inside the medulla oblongata, we would see several nuclei. So first of all, we see these olives, these green things. They made the inferior olives green, I guess because olives are green, and anatomists thought they bulged out and looked like olives. So hence the name. So these green things are supposed to be the inferior olivary complex. And these are going to be very important in regulating motor control. So these are going to be connected to the cerebellum, to other areas of the brainstem, to the cerebrum. And one of the main functions of the inferior olivary complex is to provide an error signal to the cerebellum. So we're going to have some specialized neurons here called climbing, or neurons that will send their axons called climbing fibers up to the cerebellum. And that those climbing fibers will synapse on what we call Purkinje cells, which are the main output cells of the cerebellum. And this is hypothesized or believed to provide an error signal to the cerebellum. So it's providing information about what you're doing with your skeletal muscles right now and comparing it to the desired thing that you want to do with the skeletal muscles. So basically, the cerebellum is comparing what you're actually doing with what you'd like to be doing and making corrections so that you have fluid, smooth movements. And so you don't have herky-jerky movements, and that you're able to execute the movements that you're actually trying consciously to execute. And all this is going on below the conscious level. So you have a lot of these systems in the brainstem that are fine-tuning conscious processes, but you're not aware of all of these sort of loops of comparing what you're actually doing to your intended target movement. So the inferior olives are a very important part of the medulla oblongata. Behind that, we have our cardiovascular centers, which comprise both our cardiac center as well as our vasomotor center, which we've already talked about previously. We've got our solitary nucleus. That is going to be receiving information that's going to be ascending up the spinal cord. That's going to be receiving information from our viscera. So from visceral organs like the heart, the respiratory system, the GI tract, and so forth. Then we're going to have our nucleus cuneatus and nucleus gracilis, which they've actually mixed up where they're pointing to on this diagram. So the nucleus cuneatus is actually this one. It's lateral and it's wedge-shaped, this blue one. The nucleus gracilis is the medial one, and it is long and thin. So gracile literally means slender or long and thin. So this is the approximate location of these nuclei that are going to be receiving proprioceptive information from skeletal muscles and as well as fine touch. So the way I like to think of the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus is they kind of make the shape of a person. So this was my meme to help me remember what's what. So here I've drawn the gracile nuclei, long and thin, and that corresponds to these ones right here. And that would be those. And the cuneate nuclei, which are wedge-shaped, and they're going to be receiving information, the wedge-shaped ones, are going to be receiving information, well, from the shoulders, the arms, the upper arms, and the upper torso, whereas the gracile nuclei will be receiving information from the legs and the lower torso. And so I figured that if I drew this picture as a person with the legs attached to the gracile nuclei and the arms attached to the cuneate nuclei, that would be a pretty good way to remember. All right, now let's look at it from a posterior lateral view. So we're looking at it slightly at an angle. We're looking at it from the side but slightly behind. Here, once again, we see our olivary nuclei. This is going to be very important for motor control. We're going to have our reflex centers, such as our cardiovascular centers, which are going to contain both our cardiac and our vasomotor centers. Behind that, we're going to have our respiratory rhythmicity center, which is going to be in contact with two centers from the Pons that we'll study a little bit later, called the apneustic and pneumotaxic centers. And together, these nuclei will be regulating breathing. All right, then we have our nucleus gracilis, which I think they actually did put in the right place this time, and our nucleus cuneatus, again, will be bringing information about proprioception and fine touch from the body. We have our solitary nucleus, which in this case, they just basically made this gray thing represent something else. These are the nuclei of the cranial nerves 8 through 11. And remember that cranial nerve 8, which is the vestibulocochlear nerve, bringing information about auditory sensation and balance, is going to be processed in that nucleus, and that's going to be right at the border between the medulla oblongata and the pons. And finally, we have the reticular formation that's going to go all the way up through the brainstem. It's going to end in the midbrain, and this is going to be very important for regulating our awareness, our consciousness, mediating our arousal. All right, so now let's move on to the pons. And here we have our sensory and motor nuclei of cranial nerves 5 through 8. Again, 8 sitting on the border between the pons and the medulla oblongata. Once again, we can talk about those nuclei involved with respiration. These are going to be in communication with our respiratory rhythmicity center in the medulla oblongata, and they're just going to modify it. And these are called the apneustic and pneumotaxic centers. And when we study the cardiovascular system, we'll study their function in a little bit more detail. We will also have some nuclei that are going to be relaying information to and from the cerebellum. And we're going to have ascending and descending tracts that are going to be relaying information from lower areas such as the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata up to the thalamus and other brainstem areas, as well as the cerebrum eventually. And we're also going to have transverse fibers. You probably remember last time we talked about our transverse pontine fibers, and these are going to be conveying information to the cerebellum. So they're going to be conveying information from pontine nuclei to the cerebellum on the opposite hemisphere. Remember, pons means bridge, and it looks very much like a bridge out there in the front of the brainstem here. So the pons is this part right here. And these are the transverse pontine fibers that are white matter tracts, and they're going to be relaying information from the pons to the cerebellum. And they're going to be relaying information from pontine nuclei on one side to the cerebellum on the opposite hemisphere. And these transverse pontine fibers are going to be interconnected with the cerebellum via some tracts of white matter called the middle cerebellar peduncle. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get to the cerebellum. But this is an important tract that's going to communicate information from the pons to the cerebellum. All right, so if we look at it, here's a lateral view. Here we can see our reticular formation ascending up from the medulla oblongata through the pons on the way to the midbrain. We're going to be having our descending tracts. Obviously, we're going to have everything coming from the cerebrum and other brainstem nuclei, I should say. The cerebrum and brainstem nuclei are going to have to pass through the pons on their way to the spinal cord. Some things will be passing to the cerebellum. We're going to have ascending tracts that are going to be bringing information up from the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata, and we're going to have our apneustic and pneumotaxic centers here. So these, remember, are going to be in communication with our respiratory rhythmicity center within the medulla oblongata. And we're also going to have our attachment points for cranial nerves 5 through 8.